Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the West Coast. Thank you all for being here. My name is Diane Crocker, and I'm the Principal Analyst at Lightbox and the moderator for today's event. So our focus here today is on the one challenge that we face as a society that the COVID-19 health crisis has really brought into stark relief. And that is the lack of reliable broadband access in many of our rural and our urban communities. And when communities and homes today don't have Wi-Fi, it limits access to a number of critical services. I think as any parent of school-age children can attest, the false start to the school year lends a unique urgency to this issue. Many districts across the country opted either for full distance learning plans or hybrid models for students. And this approach really puts students at a disadvantage in areas that still lack necessary Wi-Fi access. If your doctors aren't doing in-office visits, then you know how critical reliable broadband is for meeting health needs. And of course, professionals like us need broadband access in order to work effectively from home. So the list of critical services that we now can't live without and that require broadband is a long one. So given this urgent need, federal, state, and local governments are starting to channel efforts into public and private partnerships that enable putting that necessary infrastructure in place to bring broadband access to those areas of the country that need it most right now. So why we're here today and what we're going to spend the next hour or so doing is hearing from leading experts who are really dedicated to harnessing technology innovations in order to advance research in this area. And the hope is that that kind of research will really affect meaningful change in identifying coverage gaps and where they are. And what that does is it enables efforts to really be channeled quickly and effectively and pave a path toward economic development initiatives that really are focused on improving broadband access to communities across the country. So we're very, very fortunate to have here today experts who, hopefully thanks to a strong and reliable Wi-Fi signal, are dialing in from Colorado, from Baltimore, and from Atlanta. So first up is my colleague here at Lightbox, Zach Wade. Zach is the Vice President of Data Science here at Lightbox, and he will be highlighting his work creating a broadband serviceable location fabric to bring transparency to coverage gaps as a very important first step in identifying geographic priorities. Zach is then going to turn the baton over to a duo at Johns Hopkins University, which is my old college town of Baltimore. Matt Kahn is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins, as well as the director of the 21st Century Initiative. Matt is a prolific author and speaker, and he's here today with his co-presenter, Mac McComas, to talk about the fascinating research that they're doing there into the digital divide that exists in our cities, the societal cost of gaps in coverage, and the economic benefits of fiber network build out. And then Matt and Mac will turn things over to Bill Price. Bill is the Senior Strategy Analyst at the Georgia Technology Authority. Bill has extensive experience in the telecom field and the private sector, and he's really brought that expertise to bear in helping to develop and manage the Digital Georgia program to increase the state's use of technology across business and government. Bill is currently focused on implementing broadband legislation, the Achieving Connectivity Act for the state of Georgia, which was passed in 2018. So Bill is here with a really interesting story to tell, a real world example on how his state got a handle on those gaps in broadband coverage and is using that to focus efforts. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Zach with just a really quick logistical item, which is we're all here to learn. So as the speakers are presenting, if any of you have any questions at all, please do use the Q&A button to submit those. And I will come back on after Bill's presentation to moderate the Q&A at the tail end of this. So thank you all for being here. And with that, I will turn things over to Zach. Zach?
Thank you, Diane. Let's see, can you progress to the next? Oh yeah, I'll just share my screen. All right, so I'm basically here today to first put it in context. So at Lightbox, we do work both with Matt and Mac at Johns Hopkins and State of Georgia and Bill on broadband mapping. So I'll cover kind of our relationships there, and then also discuss the technology that Lightbox is bringing to the table, technology and data, to help solve this issue. So to put it in context first, so this digital divide, which Matt and Mac are gonna get into in greater detail, but one of the reasons that we care about this at Lightbox is aligned with our mission to use our data and technology to help solve social problems. And one of these social problems that became really apparent with the onset of COVID is the unequal access to Wi-Fi, particularly for students, also working professionals, but the sort of future outcome concern for students is where our primary focus was at the beginning. And what we mean by that is basically, so the idea of the education system is that everybody should have equal access to it. But when COVID came, basically a lot of students no longer had the same access to teachers, ability to do their schoolwork, to do research. And the problem with that, there are many problems with it, but one obvious one is that the potential future outcomes of those students will be diminished because of just due to their lack of access to what these days is really a basic right almost, and that being Wi-Fi access. That really dovetails well with the work that Bill Price at the state of Georgia is doing as well, and relates back to our relationship, helping them create a broadband map for the state. And Bill will get into this in greater detail too, but they've done some really interesting work leveraging that map to then identify where they can concentrate resources to basically bring Wi-Fi access to those kids. So this is how we're basically thinking about it at Lightbox. For quick background on what we have a large data set of parcel boundaries, and these boundaries are really important for tying together other geospatial data. One of those other geospatial data types being basically whether a Wi-Fi signal is basically emitted from a given location. And we get that data with a latitude and longitude coordinate, so a point, and then we're able to tie that to parcel boundaries, building footprints, and then all these other boundary types like school boundaries, which comes into play to assessing that the previous problem that I mentioned, and then tying over property characteristics. So we know if there's Wi-Fi in a commercial property versus a residential property, and then we're able to overlay demographic information and a bunch of other data to really get an understanding of the distribution of the problem. And really there are two pieces of Wi-Fi or broadband connectivity that can lead to problems. So one is economic barriers. So this really is pervasive in more urban areas where it's not necessarily true that the infrastructure isn't in place. It's more the case that households don't have the money to pay for broadband. So in our solution to creating a broadband map, that's one of the situations that we have to touch on. And then the other is the more obvious structural barrier to connectivity, and that'd be infrastructure isn't in place. So those are basically the two types of lack of access to Wi-Fi or broadband that we care to investigate. And our basically the solution at Lightbox is brought to bear using the boundary data we have, our capability in tying addresses to properties, geocoding them, and then partnering with other providers that can get us that insight onto whether a structure has logged into Wi-Fi or not, basically. So now I'm gonna dig into a couple more specific analyses that we did in the state of Georgia. So this first one is basically showing two plots. The plot on the left is broadband on the x-axis you see broadband per capita, and on the y-axis you see the COVID-19 case rate. And this is aggregated over the entire period since it started. Basically, the point of that one is to show that everybody is affected by COVID. There's no real defined trend in you know, people who have access to broadband relative to those who get COVID. It didn't discriminate, at least along that dimension. But in the plot on the right, basically we're looking at broadband access relative to income, and this is aggregated at the census block group level. So on the x-axis, we have essentially number of broadband access points per capita within a region, and on the y-axis, we have the income per capita. And in this one, you see a very strong correlation between the two, where higher income translates to greater access to broadband. And so with this simple analysis, we can dig into both that structural and economic connectivity issue. So for this one, basically I'm highlighting that larger populations don't necessarily have greater access to broadband. So to kind of dig into what the plot is showing here, larger circles and darker circles are basically indicating more urban areas. So wherever there's a larger or darker circle, it's denser population. And if it was the case that every household within an urban area had, easy widespread access to broadband, we would expect these large and dark circles to be clustered toward the upper right of this plot, or at least maybe not to the upper right, but at least somewhere to the right where there's large broadband access. So this is basically highlighting that economic access is an issue even within cities. The other side of the spectrum, small populations with low income and low broadband exist out there. This is entangling the economic and structural barriers to connectivity. So broadband companies are less likely to develop their networks in rural areas. So that's one reason for the lack of access there. But then income is also low, so it's hard to disentangle those two effects. And that's one of the challenges that we are working on solving with the data we have access to. And then finally, high income can lead to broadband access in any case. So this is likely, so these are also rural properties or rural locations with high access to broadband, and that's likely enabled by satellite, which is expensive but available. So it's one solution where economics can get you to the connectivity, but it's prohibitively expensive for some groups out there. Now I'm basically going to turn to some of the solutions that Lightbox has to address this. So the map you see here is from our Land Vision application, and this is over Atlanta, simply overlaying some demographic information in this case, distribution of income in this area. So red is lower income and green is higher income. And this is an application that we're working on inserting that broadband data into for the whole country eventually. So governments and other researchers like Matt and Mac will be able to dig into this data and make decisions off of it. So basically the way that we tie this together, to date, for example, with the state of Georgia, we brought together parcel boundaries, so millions of polygons, an example of which is shown here in this lower left panel over Atlanta. So these are the boundary files for the entire country. And then we also attach addresses to each of the properties there, and then ingest, tie together broadband data, which in the case for Georgia, they got access to broadband provider data and were able to do that merge. But Lightbox is basically working on ingesting that data set ourselves to create this national broadband map. And finally, just to highlight the work that we did with Georgia as essentially a test bed for hopefully creating a more widespread version of this. This is taken from the state of Georgia's website, which is the result of our partnership with them. So they ingested our parcels, our address data, and then partnered with the local broadband agencies to tie together that latitude, longitude level access information and understand down to the property level what areas are underserved across the state. And this map in particular is aggregating it up at the county level. but for the decision makers within the state, they're able to actually drill down to specific properties and pick where they need to invest in whether by connecting properties just by funding it or actually laying down the new infrastructure. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt and Mac with Johns Hopkins.
Thanks, Zach.
Folks, this is Matt. Mac and I are going to tag team in this presentation as we talk about access to broadband in cities, and we're going to talk about productive places, people, and firms. Zach's presentation was fantastic, and as an academic economist, I love what Lightbox is creating. So Mac, stay with me. First slide. I'm really excited about what Lightbox has created of the data. And Zach had this terrific graph that I hope you saw of this positive correlation between per capita income and broadband access. And as an economist and as a microeconomist, what fascinates me that is the chicken and egg. Which way does the causality go? Do richer people sign up for broadband for that fast Los Angeles Lakers downloads? Or when a place has access to broadband, does that contribute to prosperity? I think Mac and I want to talk to you about both of these points today. And Mac, I'm now ready for the next slide. Are we able to advance? Oh, thank you. And so what we at the 21st Century Cities Initiative are thinking about is we're part of Johns Hopkins and we're an urban economic shop, but we're in deep thought about companies' competitiveness, both within cities such as Baltimore, but around the United States, and how firms, whether in Las Vegas or cities in Seattle, Cleveland, for different cities, what is their comparative advantage? And going back in economic history, different areas have had an advantage based on their infrastructure and based on natural advantage. In the modern economy, broadband is such a key part of modern infrastructure for a city to function. And when a city doesn't function, there's more likely to be poverty in that city, and people are less likely to achieve their full potential in terms of acquiring skills. And as Diane was saying, having access to telemedicine and all the great pieces of what the modern economy offers. Mac, next slide, please. And so Mac and I are getting ready to publish a book, so a little bit of marketing. Mac and I have written a book that will be coming out in a couple of months. And we're very eager to work with Lightbox on research related to this. For cities like Baltimore, cities that had a booming manufacturing past, but in recent decades have lost people, what investments can be made in infrastructure and in people to make cities like Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, Baltimore stronger? And just as there's a complementarity between peanut butter and jelly, we think, and we're going to argue in this brief presentation, that if cities like Baltimore could upgrade their broadband infrastructure, this would create new opportunities for the people of Baltimore, and they'd be more likely to invest in their own skills. And so in the language of economics, there's a complementarity between people's investment in skills and access to fast internet. And I think that that's an important idea. That what Mac and I argue in our book, and if you listen to the next 20 seconds, you won't have to buy our book. What we argue in our book is that so many of America's post-industrial cities suffer from a coordination failure. People are not investing enough in their skills. The city is not investing enough in its infrastructure. Real estate developers are not investing enough in rebuilding the cities, and businesses are not investing enough in starting up businesses. And that this is, when these cities don't succeed, this is an ugly self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the expansion of broadband infrastructure in these cities can play a role in boosting these cities. Folks, our presentation today is going to focus on older cities. In newer cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, the beauty of building a new city is you have all new stuff, and we're very confident that you can build in new infrastructure like broadband easily. But in older cities, when you have to retrofit a city, there's more issues of cost. Before we go on, I want to highlight something that Diane mentioned. I also think that broadband can be crucial for rural areas. The Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and Anne Case wrote a great book called Deaths from Despair, where they documented the poverty and challenges in rural America. I believe that with the rise of work from home, that quality of life could greatly improve in rural areas from the expansion of broadband internet into these areas. And I'm optimistic that rural areas can have an improvement in quality of life if broadband is built out to them. And I'd like to work with Lightbox on this. Mac, next slide, please. Mac, this one is yours.
Yeah, so thanks, Matt. And as Zach highlighted, a major issue in broadband adoption and take up and access is poverty. So in 6 of the cities that Matt and I study in our book, which are Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, as you can see in this table at the bottom of the slide, you have some pretty low wired broadband connection rates. And broadband can be up to $100 a month in some of these cities. I know it's around that in Baltimore. And so for poor households in these cities, they simply just can't afford it. Again, all cities are not the same. So you look at a booming city like Seattle, and they have a 83% wired broadband connection rate, and they've improved over recent years. But Baltimore from 2016 to 2019 has barely moved the needle at all, improving less than 1%. So if poor families and poor people can't access the internet, you might ask the question of why does this matter? And Zach and Diane have highlighted how this affects students' ability to fully engage in school, and of course people's ability to work remotely. But there's some other ways that it plays in as well.
So when economists talk about experience goods, so folks, we've got a laundry list here. When economists talk about experience goods, I want to bring you back to the movie Star Wars. I might be one of the older people here on this call. So when I was 11, when Star Wars came out, it never would have occurred to me if I just read in the New York Post or New York Times that there's going to be a movie about outer space. Until you see the movie Star Wars, you don't appreciate what a great movie it is. That's an experience good that you only know its value once you've experienced it. Something that interests me is part of the low take-up rate in Baltimore for signing up for broadband. Is it not only the price, but that people don't have experience with it to know what they would gain. And so, folks, we have here a laundry list, and all of you know this, that we're able to stream this today, I believe, is tied to broadband. And so with broadband, if it could be brought to poor people in poor cities, I believe this would have a causal effect on reducing their poverty. I've been in talks with Zach about how we can rigorously test that hypothesis. In the scientific language, you want to randomly assign expanded access to broadband and see if great things happen to poor people who now have access to it. And folks, here's the laundry list. Their children could be on Khan Academy learning more, better able to find jobs and knowing what's going on in the local labor market to find the right match for them. As Diane was saying, access to telemedicine. Some people don't pay the transaction costs of heading to the hospital. Could we have greater health care for people if we make it easier? And of course, access to Amazon, access to YouTube. There's both the leisure and productivity effects of access to broadband. And Mac and I, in our research shop, and as optimists that we can reduce poverty in cities, the last point interests us very much, of the role of internet access facilitating the gig economy and helping small business people achieve their dreams. Matt, can I ask you for a specific example of that before I turn over the presentation to you?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, it's no secret that a lot of entrepreneurs use the internet to start up their businesses in terms of not only just, a business has to have some sort of online presence today, whether it's a website or a Facebook page or social media, but also there are just a lot of straightforward entrepreneurs who can do things like be sort of solo entrepreneurs doing web design services or graphic design or social media marketing. These are things that a singular person can do and self-employ themselves with good access to the internet. But barring that, and if you don't have the skills to do and engage in those sort of activities, you're losing a real opportunity.
Mac, you're on. What's the next slide?
So this is looking at firm productivity gains. And so we mentioned some of the gains to people, but when you look at cities and the infrastructure of where not just broadband access is, but really high speed, so gigabit service we're talking about here, where that's available in cities can ultimately determine where you get some of these high growth tech enabled businesses to locate. So, certainly in the Baltimore and DC area, there are sort of growing clusters of cybersecurity and biotech companies, and where these companies are and are not able to locate is some way, shape, and form determined by where high-speed internet access is built out to. So to give another example, Cleveland and Northeast Ohio over the past several decades have heavily invested in fiber networks in connecting hospitals and schools, realizing that this could really be a difference maker in the healthcare industry. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of our research looking at the digital divide in Baltimore. And so this is a map of census tracts in the city, and lighter shades are lower broadband access rates and darker shades are higher broadband access rates. So overall in the city, 40% of households lack a wired internet connection, broadband connection, but it differs greatly by neighborhood. The lowest is 38% and the highest is 95% of households. But what I find really interesting is that you see that there are a lot of these white shaded tracts that border darker shade tracts. So for example, in the northwest corner of the city where the Pimlico horse racing stadium is located, there's a neighborhood that has 38% of households with broadband access, and just to the north, just neighboring, the neighboring tract has a 91.5% uptake rate. So these two neighborhoods are vastly different, but they're right next to each other, and their experience with the internet is drastically different. And then going back to, this will look very similar to something that Zach showed earlier. This is again a plot of census tracts and by median household income and the percent of households with broadband of any type, so not just a wired connection. And as you see, affordability is a huge issue. As I mentioned, it can cost up to $100 a month. And just again, another example there that this Pimlico neighborhood with the lowest adoption rate in the city had a median income of $29,000. And then you look at upper income neighborhoods like Federal Hill, and the uptake rate there is 95%. So, while affordability is a huge issue, I don't think it should be the sole focus of it. A lot of it also has to do with just sort of demystifying, as Matt mentioned, realizing the full potential of what you could get out of broadband. So people might think of it as, just something you can watch YouTube or get on Facebook with. But there are these other services that we highlighted in banking and telehealth and government, and a lot of people just don't realize that. So That's part of it. A lot of it is just, you know, having neighbors who also use the internet and who can help you with either maintenance issues or navigating services on the internet. All these things definitely matter.
Matt, can I pick up on that? So to wrap up, Matt, was this our last slide?
Yes.
I'm having a senior moment. I want to pick up and close on what Mac was just saying. So in many cases in capitalism, like if I go to a Starbucks and buy a coffee, that has no impact on Mac. But Mac just gave a great example where if Matt and Mac are neighbors in Baltimore, and if I gain access to broadband, that he benefits from this is I tell him information that I've learned. And so something that interests me and Mac very much is that broadband is an example of a positive externality good that in poor communities, the community can be stronger as more members of the community are in the loop, having access to the internet in ways that people like me take for granted, that this expansion of opportunity can offer broader benefits. And so this raises a public policy issue. If the city of Baltimore thought about offering a subsidy to people in poor neighborhoods to subsidize their broadband, and as economists, it would interest me very much to debate and study whether Baltimore's poverty would decline. So Matt, can I put you on the spot? If we could run that policy and have a 15% subsidy for the price of broadband, could we as economists estimate the take-up rate of how many poor people who previously haven't signed up would? And would their community become stronger?
Yeah, and I think you are seeing this in a lot of neighborhoods in Baltimore where there are some of these subsidized programs going in, and you see uptake rates rise. And as you mentioned, it really opens up a whole world of possibilities. And you know, a lot of the focus has been on students getting access to education, but you know, there are elderly people in these neighborhoods. There are unemployed working people in these neighborhoods. So, you know, the more people you can get online, the better.
So what we're trying to team up with Lightbox on is to identify expansions of broadband and then to think creatively, a la Freakonomics, of what are indicators of improvements in quality of life in these neighborhoods along the lines Max said. So folks, if this interests you, please get in touch with us. And this is why we're so excited to work with Lightbox. Diane, thank you very much.
So now we'll turn things over to Bill. Is Bill here? Hi, Bill.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I'm Bill Price with the state of Georgia. I'm part of a multi-agency team of people with various backgrounds and expertise in different areas who are working together to implement the legislation that the state passed. And we call the program the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative, GBDI for short. And the goal, of course, the ultimate goal is to expand broadband availability throughout the entire state for everyone. So I'm going to go through some slides quickly and just give you a sense and a context of what we've been doing and where we are and how we're going about doing that. The extended team, this slide, hopefully you can see it. You can see it, right?
Yes, we can.
I see heads nodding, cool. It involves a number of state agencies. The Department of Community Affairs is the lead agency for the program, and agencies like mine and DOT and state properties and DOE and some universities, we all fall in line behind their leadership to go about the various projects to pull this off. We do have advisors that represent local government, counties and cities and providers, electric cooperatives, and others that we regularly meet with and run ideas by and get ideas from them. The first thing that we did that was tasked to us by the legislation was to create a new Georgia broadband availability map, which is significantly different in statute from what the FCC does. The FCC codes a census block is served if one location can get 25.3 or faster. In our case, in statute, it says that 80% or more of the locations have to be able to buy it in order for that block to be coded as served. So the map on the right shows you the very graphically distinct difference between one approach versus the other. And as Zach was pointing out, we use their parcel and address data to start the process. There's over 5 million locations, almost 300,000 census blocks. And at the end of the day, what we discovered is in Georgia, at least, there's 507,000 unserved locations, which is over 1 million people who couldn't buy it if they wanted to buy it. And of course, as you might imagine, the bulk of those unserved locations are in what we classify as rural counties. And this graphic here just sort of gives you a percentage. So statewide, you include everything, it's like 10% are unserved, but when you go to the rural counties, it's a much higher percentage. So I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. This next slide, really, like I said, behind the web page and the map that the public can go to and move around and search for their address, et cetera, is backed up, is created out of what we call the master address file database, which is the location fabric down to each structure with long points on the structures, if we can get them there. Matched up with the service availability data that came in from 43 service providers, and that included city and county government sewer service providers, electric cooperative service providers, big telcos, tiny telcos, cable companies, everybody. So we got everybody to participate. The legislation that was passed protected their individual data from being shared, so they were comfortable in collaborating with us. So this is a huge data collaboration project, if you will, to create this map. This slide is a little bit of detail of the process that the GIS team went through to create a map that is accurate as we can humanly get it. And like I said, we source the initial starting address data file and the parcel data file for all 159 counties and from Lightbox, and they've been great to work with. And then we pull in ancillary data sets, like Microsoft made their building footprint data available for free if you're not commercializing it. We got from the electric companies, we got their meter lat long coordinates, which is a really good indicator that it's a real structure that's actually being used. And then there's a lot of cleansing and geocoding analysis and verification of location accuracy that takes place with the GIS team. And then of course, we bring in all the providers' data and we go through the same process and match it up. And of course, behind this census block level map, there's actually the data that actually shows all the points, red, they're unserved, green, they're served. And where we're at is, in order to determine cost and run cost models and project costs, which matters, accuracy really does matter, especially when you get into larger parcels. You want to try and get the point on the structure itself. So, good decisions comes from good data, and good data means as accurate as you can get it. So that really matters. And this is what it looks like with a satellite view, and you actually can place the points on the actual unit, especially where there's multiple dwelling units, apartment complexes, low income housing. And when you're talking to providers and you're running cost models, accurate data totally impacts what you're able to do with limited funding. And at the end of the day, broadband availability is about infrastructure investment, which is pretty expensive, and basically unserved areas are what economists would call market failures. There's not enough revenue to offset the investment and the expected return on investment. So, the way we look at all of this and analyze it and determine, where we're going to deploy limited funds is based on the return on investment, because we as government are in effect offering to match provider investments to try and incent them to contribute their investment and go build out and operate and provide a service. Once we've got good data, then we can generate informational products that are helpful to providers, that are helpful to us, that are helpful to local governments of all types, cities and counties. If they're thinking about doing special purpose taxes or bond raising to try and expand broadband availability, We can help guide them on, where the greatest opportunities are with limited funding. This is basically an example of the cost model that we've been able to run, where we can derive an average cost per census block. And in Georgia, we've done it for both fiber to the home and fixed wireless. And fixed wireless on average is approximately 50% of the cost of fiber to the home, where you can do fixed wireless, and you can't do it everywhere. And then we have, BI tools that we use and do scatter plots, just like Zach was showing, where we can, again, provide useful information to all of ourselves and providers, and cities and counties to examine and prioritize which blocks we're going after, which blocks have the lowest cost versus the highest cost, where the greatest concentration of unserved locations are. And recently, because of COVID, we worked with the DOE. We've been supporting them, and they gave us their student location database, and we overlaid that with the served and unserved. And we're able to create dashboards for them and do a great deal of analysis on where the unserved students, and as was articulated earlier, in the state of Georgia, 60% of our entire student population that resides in about 1.8 million locations lives at or below poverty, meaning they can't afford to buy broadband, even if it is available. The bigger problem there, of course, is highlighted that it's really not access and where broadband infrastructure is. It is about affordability. And of course, we're watching, and we do analysis on what the federal government's doing with the FCC and the RDOF $20 billion fund that's about to hit, and where that's potentially going to impact our unserved locations. The one on the right shows the dark gray is where there are eligible locations in Georgia for RDOF funds, which is about 181,000 locations. So that could potentially have a big impact in reducing the availability issue in Georgia. And of course, we're looking deeply at all kinds of technology options that are available to address the issues in the worst counties. We have counties that are just basically infrastructure deserts, where there's really not any strong wireless signal there, and there's not any fiber there. And so we're trying to figure out what's the best options at the least cost to deliver service to them. We're using wireless data and tools from a company called Ookla to examine wireless signal strength as we work with DOE and the school districts to deploy Wi-Fi amplifiers on buses, or deploy Wi-Fi amplifiers, broadcasters on buildings. Let's see, in the next slide, right now we're working intensively on a project to fund deployment and access to students who live in low-income properties. There's a set of properties called Section 8. There's about 900 of them in the state of Georgia, with about 35,000 students who live in them that we're targeting, and we're doing analysis and evaluation on right now. And of course, having accurate location data and where they are is critical. So we're using the data from Lightbox for that. And then at the end of the day, what our program and our team of people do is we offer the expertise that the people that we have, either ourselves or contractors that we have under contract, with all this data and tools to help the governor's office, the legislature, and local governments figure out where to go. That's mine. Sorry I went so fast, but I felt like I didn't want to use all your time.
No, that was great, Bill. Thank you. I love the line that you said, that good decisions come from good data. That's great. All right, let's move to some Q&A now. And we had a couple that came in. One, I'm not sure which one of you it's for, but it's from a brownfields professional in Wisconsin, and it's our rural township suffers from reliable internet access, and we've set up a committee to explore options for coverage. Do any of you have information on coverage options?
Is that
Well,
coverage options of, oh, sorry, Bill, did you have an answer to that?
I assume he means broadband coverage.
Well, at the end of the day, if it's availability as opposed to, performance issues, right? The companies who invest already in an area typically is the providers in that area. The state probably has a broadband office, coordinating office, and they probably know which providers are in the area and can facilitate conversations that take place. But at the end of the day, if there's not a positive ROI for them to invest, and there's not a subsidy coming from somewhere for them to invest, then really the option for local government is to raise fund themselves and offer that. And we see that in Georgia, where we have counties doing bond issues, we have counties and cities doing special purpose tax issues to raise funds, and then they go do an RFI and an RFP, and then they find a partner, and then they'll fund, some build out themselves.
Bill, this is Matt. If I can ask a follow-up question. In any of those settings, is there ever talk about having a formal treatment group and control group of rolling out these efforts side by side to see if broadband access has the effects that optimists like me and Mac believe it does? Or would that be politically impossible to implement?
Matt, are you asking me that, this Bill?
Yes. Is there a way for the nerds to partner?
I have not seen that in the state of Georgia, right? Or Florida, where I did the same thing in the state of Florida. I mean, right now, think about it, prior to COVID, not much attention was being given to broadband, right? And now all of a sudden, overnight, everybody's paying attention to broadband. So we're early into how we as a nation and all of us in our different places deal with this, right? And of course, COVID puts urgency and priorities on, like us in Georgia, around student access, right? Or healthcare telemedicine, right? But, I'm just not aware of people doing comparative studies.
Thank you. And Zach, to pick up on this, can we imagine that a future infrastructure bill, we know that presidential candidates talk about infrastructure, and in your research, could broadband be part of an infrastructure bill? I just don't know the facts there at the federal level of whether there could be money for subsidies for an expansion of the grid.
Yeah, I believe there is. It's definitely being spoken about at the FCC level, and there are, as Bill mentioned, efforts for the FCC to at least begin the mapping, which is the first step, obviously, because we need to know where the deficiencies are before the investment can happen. But yeah, that's an early indicator that they are willing to put money behind it, I would say.
And it has happened historically. If you look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, they had the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, which I think had about $4 billion in funding for, it was a variety of things, mapping, skills training, but infrastructure build out was a significant portion of that as well.
Interesting. We did get another question, and I think, Bill, you hit on this a little bit, but I'll throw it out there and see if we're missing anything. The question is there a plan to incentivize the poor? Is there some subsidized effort to provide the necessary new hardware, computer software, and the help to provide the underserved with credit for not only connectivity, but equipment? Bill, I know you mentioned bonds. Is there anything else?
Well, right now across the entire country, every state DOE and all the school districts are working to do just that for students. T-Mobile just announced a big program where they're going to provide free MiFi devices and 5 years of free service in every state to 10 million students. And like in Georgia, they're going to allocate 65,000 of those each year for 5 years. So, and each time a student gets one, they get 5 years of free service. So that is enormous, right? And then you have the COVID funds that are hitting the governor's offices, and you have COVID funds that are hitting the DOEs. And so everybody is working together feverishly all the way down to the school district. Like right now, the project we're working on to provide internet access for free to students in low income properties, right? The funds are going to pay for the build out, and the funds are going to pay for internet service, right? And our target is 35,000 students for that. Now, what happens is all these options come down to the school district people. And it's up to the school district people to decide which option they're going to put in front of which parent, right? So whether it's the T-Mobile offer or whether it's the low income property offer. So we're all working hard to arm them with every means possible to make sure that the students can go online and do instruction.
Bill, this is Matt. I'm going to keep interviewing you, but it's fascinating what you were saying. Will somebody track the data of which parents were made which offer, like the T-Mobile one, and whether the parents take up an offer? Are such micro data going to be collected and recorded?
It will be at the district level. So, you know, a lot of the actual implementation and relationship takes place between the district and the parents, right? So that they have a huge role to play, and we arm them with information and data and say, here's your options, right? And then it's up to them to make those decisions and track them. We will know. So for example, with the money we're going to spend to provide connectivity, we will know who we're ordering service to, right, at the properties.
So
And will the state DOE try and aggregate all the decisions that were made? I don't know. If they have time later, maybe.
So Zach, that would be my beg of you, building on what Bill was just saying. If Lightbox could play a role aggregating data across school districts, I think that would be really cool. Because it would. Any thoughts there, or I do not know Lightbox's short-run data agenda.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a current partnership in place with Georgia to aggregate that outcome data, but I think it's something we'd be interested in pursuing, and we can definitely take that conversation with Bill. If Georgia would be interested in us doing that, I don't know, but yeah, at Lightbox we see the value in aggregating data along all these dimensions to help make better decisions, both from a social perspective and, you know, a future cities growth perspective. So yeah, it's certainly aligned with our capabilities.
Bill, here's a question for you. I know that we have folks on the call from similar organizations at the state level in California and Washington, and I'm wondering, based on this mammoth effort that you've been involved in, if you would offer any advice to folks like you in other states or lessons learned.
Well, you need legislation that assigns the responsibility to a lead agency, and of course you need budget to go undertake, you know, a statewide location level mapping exercise. So you got to have legislation to get the providers to give you their data. You've got to have protections so that their location availability data is not subject to public records. So you got to have that in your legislation. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff. I mean, more than we have time to cover here, but there's absolutely some lessons learned and some things you'd want to have.
Yeah. And then Zach, you mentioned Georgia as kind of a test bed. Are there other states we know of that have similar efforts underway already?
Yeah, I believe a large chunk of the country actually, and then there's the national effort as well that the FCC is behind, and basically creating a national map of where there is and isn't access. And that's really a goal of ours to help create, like we did with Georgia, and to the extent Georgia wants to continue at that national level with us, that would be awesome. But yeah, because we have parcel boundaries for the whole country, building footprints, addresses those are data sets that we can ingest and process at scale. Really the only missing piece, which we're actually very close to solving, at least at an initial level, is the national broadband data. But we have partners for that as well. So our goal is actually national next, and hopefully successful on that soon.
Mm-hmm. Great. We don't have any other questions from the audience. Matt, do you have any other questions for Bill before we close out?
I've learned a lot from him. He's got a future as a professor at Hopkins. And so I think that this is such a fascinating topic. And so that's the end of my lecture.
Thank you. We are closing in on the top of the hour, so we'll stop there. We will be circulating a recording of this event to anybody who's interested, and you can feel free to circulate it. So to today's speakers, Zach, Matt, Mac, and Bill, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's such an important and timely effort that you're all engaged in. So on behalf of Lightbox, everybody, thank you for tuning in, and stay well, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.